Hello. Is everything okay?
Let's check with the chat room. Is he coming in, guys?
Am I coming through?
Yes, but quiet. Okay, I'm gonna have to turn you up a little bit.
Well, is it my proximity? Is this better?
Well, I just changed you up too, so that should be a lot louder for now.
Yeah. Well, hopefully he's all hearing us okay. If not, it's probably oh god. If not, it's probably for the best.
Hold on, I think I can even turn it up more, just in case. Because it's really loud for me, but... Okay. Okay, cool.
If it's too loud, just let us know and I'll turn myself down and just.
No, that's okay. Okay, man.
Okay.
Well, so just give a brief introduction, man.
Yeah, so Perspective Philosophy on YouTube. Essentially, I do philosophy videos related primarily to veganism, but I do general philosophy as well. I'm a PhD student, currently studying for my PhD, actually related to veganism. I'm writing a dialectical defense of animal liberation, although after today, I'm kind of deciding whether I'm writing a dialectic or primarily a hermeneutic account. But regardless, yeah, I'm an academic philosopher and I primarily focus on animal ethics, but I also focus on meta-ethics as well. Big fan of meta-ethics.
Okay, cool. And I mean, everyone already sort of knows me in my own chat, but I guess since you're doing a sort of recording on your end as well for me, I am Marty. My stream is called the Philosophy Chat. I've just actually began streaming. I am doing a few debates and I'll hopefully uploading some content later on. But today we're going to begin basically talking about Martin Heidegger, so a little bit of a complicated, a little bit of a complicated subject. Hope maybe we won't be doing that for too long, and I guess you're already sort of familiar with what we're going to talk perspective.
Yeah, I mean it's been a while since I've like brushed up on me Heidegger. I mean he's not an easy, as you say, he's not the easiest of thinkers, but at the same time he's very enjoyable. He's got a lot of value in his work. Um, we're just trying to look past the Nazism thing. We don't talk about that. But I mean, otherwise, essentially, the main thing I wanted to bring up was with Rem. I think we did a stream with Rem a while ago, and you mentioned there was a critique of Heidegger. I can't remember the details you gave, but I remember being very interested in the critique. And I just wanted you to kind of give it in brief. I think it was of Heidegger's. Was it on death? Was it the possibility of impossibility? I think it was a critique of, but I'm not entirely certain. But I'm very much interested in that. And obviously with Heidegger, I don't actually agree with everything Heidegger says. Essentially, Heidegger has many great points. Not all of his points, I believe, are dead on, and actually hit the money. And I think Levinas brings up some pretty good critique of Heidegger. But I think he's a very valuable thinker. So yeah, I just wanted to hear what you had to say about him.
Yeah, yeah. So again, I don't know how long we're going to be here, but my general critique was just the his analysis of being towards death, right? And just
Yeah, I thought it was. Yeah, I thought yeah.
looks like we're saying that your volume is still too low. Hold on, just a second. Is that okay? We'll see if it gets better. Okay, so I was just basically saying something like it doesn't seem that he can account for death in its ontic state, and by ontic state, it's just sort of the biophysical facts that we generally mean about death, right? There's a certain type of disjunction, or that is like sort of binary account between living and a living organism and an organism that's dead, right? So if I sort of witness certain types of people right in front of me, there's a sort of affiliation that I have with them that the lights are sort of out, right? And for Heidegger, basically he says that we always understand this type of death derivatively from dying, right? That there's a sort of existential relationship that we have, or maybe a more ontological, phenomenological, whatever you want to call it, relationship with death that we have, uh, that's predominantly related with the self, right? We understand the self through our own dying, and that is going to somehow give us information or somehow jump to death itself. But here I think there's a sort of ontological abyss, right, in between death and dying. And there's a really good quote by Basir, I think is how you pronounce his name. He says, "Thus it is precisely the fact that Dasein is already dying that disqualifies the possibility of death from being interpreted as an empirical or ontic occurrence. When properly or authentically understood, death is pure ontological possibility, not an ontic fact. Death is in and as Dasein's structure of ontological possibility, rather than merely an ontic actuality." And so that's sort of the point that I wanted to drive, that I think is wrong with Heidegger.
Like, I'm not going to lie, I think that is accounted for in Heidegger. And primarily because I don't think Heidegger sees death as something that one can actually experience. The contrary, I think that he sees it as something that is not experienceable. If I'm not coming through, by the way, just let us know. And I'll see if I can turn. All right, okay, cool. Right. Something as not experienceable, like something that goes beyond the possibilities of the given agent. When he says the possibility of impossibility, what he really means is that death is the moment in which one is obliterated and possibility ceases to occur, and that seems to be causes a moment of angst for the individual in which they will no longer, be here to experience. And it's something that they cannot have knowledge of either. Like, it's not something that you can experience and understand. That's why, like, when Heidegger even talks about when you die, it's not as if you gain knowledge of death. It's something that is experienced purely by yourself in the fact that when you die and death occurs, it's purely individual, but it's not something that you can gain knowledge of. I think the example that what was it like that he gives is that when you observe other beings as lifeless, like if you see like someone die and you see them in a lifeless state, you don't gain knowledge of death through their lifeless state. You gain knowledge of what death is, and you can kind of associate that with yourself.
But you don't think that there's a notion of nothingness there? That is, like, whatever that type of being was, right, existentially or ontologically. And here I just mean that when we're talking about Daseins, and for those people that aren't familiar with what a Dasein is in this chat room, a Dasein is just a sort of unique type of being, a sort of unique ontological species of beings that Heidegger sort of created for his philosophy in order to make sense of human beings, right?
Yeah, I think he describes it as, Dasein is, a being that commits ontological investigation.
Right.
So it's like constantly ontologically investigating itself.
Right. And there is a sense of where Dasein, I think, sort of has a step in nothingness, right? In the sense that while all human beings seem to predominantly not only have a facticity, that is a history being thrown into the world with certain types of dispositional traits, right? Anything that already constitutes who we are, and that is just what he sort of deems as facticity. And then a sort of ability of being ahead of oneself, right? Being ahead of oneself is one of the sort of Heideggerian jargons, where he says something like, okay, well, each person, when they contemplate death, they contemplate something that is not yet there, right? They contemplate their future possibility and the possibility of dying, which is just being onto death. And
yeah, I think he's still sorry.
yeah. And in one sense here, right, we're aware of death. We're aware of this nothing that we're constantly approaching. And in one sense, we are our future possibilities that we want to reconcile ourselves with. So we aren't just what we currently are, but what we want to become. And this plays also a large part in our ontology, right, as who we are as human beings. But I don't think that that would mean just because we have one step into this sort of nothingness, or no-thingness if you prefer, that's the same thing as fully experiencing death, right? But I do think that we sort of fully experience death, or the elimination or the ontological makeup of a person when we see their dead body.
You see, I think the what I kind of understood Heidegger to really be getting at is this is the point of the is in relation to inauthenticity, in which one doesn't see himself in his own behavior, as in one's actions are preconditioned within what he calls the idle talk. The idle talk is essentially individuals who culminate together and actively avoid death. So essentially, they engage in behaviors that lead them away from the angst that you feel from death. So if you let's say watching Coronation Street, and you all watch Coronation Street, and you all watch soap operas, and you join a group, and everyone cares about soap operas, and they care about the general election, or all these different things that are political dramas and so on, that don't actually affect their lives and how they are going to live their lives. They essentially are avoiding their own possibilities, that they're avoiding themselves, because they don't see themselves as finite beings which have limited time to make their mark on the world, to express themselves. And so that's why Heidegger then goes on to say, well, death essentially breaks you from this idle talk. He says that it frees you from this inauthenticity that has been perpetuated by your avoidance of death. Like you start seeing yourself as, I think he says, death is your own most possibility. So he says, like, essentially it cannot be experienced you cannot experience your own death by someone else, and you can't even contemplate your own death as being something other than your own. It's right. Like, as in it is inherently related to your psychological state, right? Your ontological state, that you aren't able to investigate anymore. You aren't able to have possibility anymore. And I think really the whole point of it is to say that, like, the limitations of possibility is what gives meaning to it. And I think you're kind of right when you say that, like, there is an aspect of nothingness in our ontological experience already. That and I think that you can take that even in a form of nihilistic interpretation, when you say that there is a meaninglessness in what possibility, that there is the possibility that that what we are is not actually being actualized in the first place. And I think this is actually probably one of the reasons I brought up Blanchot last time I spoke, because it's almost like Blanchot says, like, actually, well, death can happen in this Heideggerian sense of being towards death way before you actually die. and you can gain this angst without actually having to think about death itself. You can gain it by thinking about simply the end of your own identity, the end of the I, as it were. And in which case you can see yourself as being like essentially having a limitation to your being, as if your being was essentially construed as only like a facade of possibility, not all possibility itself. And that's where he says it's he talks about the possibility, the impossibility of possibility, where you start feeling like essential existential angst over the fact that you're not able to actually actualize what you truly are, which is like the inherent possibility of being. And I think that's really interesting. And I think that if you look at, like, kind of Heideggerian notion of death and this, like, being towards death in this respect, then I think what you kind of gain is this information that, like, when Heidegger is talking about death, he's not necessarily talking about death as something that is experienceable or that truly exists, but I think he really is talking about Dasein's psychological state towards the notion of death and the notion of not actually being here.
Well, we should be careful with the word psychological here, but yeah.
Yeah, we should. Yeah. I don't mean it in the anything to do with the field, for example. I simply mean like mental state, I should say.
Yeah. Well, Heidegger uses the word atonement, right? So
yeah,
how
Heidegger,
one finds
Heidegger's
oneself.
Yeah. Heidegger. I mean, I mean, Heidegger doesn't even believe that we're. I mean, he talks about thrownness. Yeah, he doesn't, like, he believes in thrownness, and that we're not actually, there is no, like, real what was it, like, we're outside in almost, aren't we? Like, we don't begin from an egoistical state. We don't begin from an internal self. We begin outside in terms of perception, perceiving the world, and then that's essentially where we are. We don't have this sort of like Levinas kind of flips on his head and he goes, no, we begin from the inside out, and so on. Whether that's true or not, I'm not so sure. But yeah, you're right. I shouldn't use the word psychological. But it's one of those.
Yeah, go ahead. You can finish.
I was just gonna say, it's just essentially what I kind of pick up from this whole being towards death is less about the ontology of death, because I don't think Heidegger ever really specifically says death is X. I think when he says death is the impossibility of possibility, he really just relates to the meaninglessness of death. Past death, there cannot be any meaning because it is the end of being in an idealistic sense. So that's kind of like what I got from it. But then the angst itself would be a relation to this nothingness, which I think is true that it exists far before death. But I think that's what Heidegger kind of means in the first place.
Well, thanks for the follow, Dre. Or let's see, yeah, Dre 33. But what I wanted to, but you keep, I guess you keep sort of mentioning these things, which to me would indicate that, you know, like Dasein's ontological state seems to sort of come to a sort of closure, right? I mean, we can agree that there's a sense of where Dasein dissipates or changes over into an ontic state, right? Into non-being.
Yeah.
Okay. And presumably that's not analyzable through the ontology of Dasein, right? Like,
yeah,
you said it yourself that we can't understand it that way. Well, then, if we understand death derivatively through, you know, our understanding of dying, and it can never cross over, then it can never have anything to do with death itself, right? Unless you're saying that we don't understand death.
But I think that's the point. I think that we don't understand death. It's the absurdity that inflicts the angst.
I see. So I do think that we understand something of what it means to talk about death. I would say something like, the person's no longer there. His being is, you know, ceases to be, right? I generally think that, and then it turns over into a sort of act of mourning for that person and what he was or what she was, right? We talk about sort of their past, and in this way we relate to a dead body, but generally, yeah, generally as a physical entity of some sort, as something where the lights have turned off. But I don't see a problem with that.
You see, I don't disagree in the sense that we can say that the person is no longer there. But I think the whole point of what you kind of showed is that we don't ever understand what is beyond this conceptual framework that we already have, which is the possibility in being. Like, essentially, what you end up saying is that it is not what is. And so it's almost via negativa. You can't tell me what it is, you can tell me what it's not. And I think that's kind of the point of which Heidegger is kind of getting at. It's that if you put yourself in the situation where you try to imagine the end to yourself, well, you're in a contradiction, because you have to be able to understand what it is to not be your own understanding, which is a constant, like, which seems to be impossible. And I think essentially that's what causes the angst in the first place. That's what's causing this feeling of dread.
Well, maybe the problem is that when we're trying to investigate certain things like death, we tend to think of it as something that we can investigate. But I think there's a sort of investigation of no-thingness or nothingness, right, or death itself. And I just mean the sort of complete and total lack of any sort of being, right, or any sort of Dasein there. I think that we're just talking about certain types of biophysical facts here, and those seem to be interpretable, right?
Yeah, but then he does say that's lifelessness. I think he says that. Like, he doesn't actually say, like, he does talk about it as if it's like.
But he thinks lifelessness. But he thinks lifelessness is derivative from an ontological understanding of dying, whereas I don't think that is, right? So I think, you know, that we have to sort of understand what's ever ontic and what's ever ontological as sort of equiprimordial things, as sort of things that we understand not derivatively or contingently off of one another. There's no dependence relation. It's rather that they both stand sort of independent of each other, and these are just two different ways that we understand the world, and we can't really, make a dependency relation there. I mean, this is what I sort of see, I think, in Hegel's and Schelling's sort of ontology, right? They have this, I mean, when we look at Schelling, for example, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the terminology of nature, natures, and nature is natured, right? He talks about nature as being both a product and a productivity, both as a process and something that it produced. And he thinks that these are both needed in order to talk about the world, about identity. So processes are nothing more than their product, but products are nothing more than their processes. And in that sense, they seem to be equiprimordial.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. And so when you're saying like with death and dying, I think what you're trying to say is that they're interrelated in that respect. That um there is something to be gained from the idea of if you can understand the process itself, then you understand what it is. Is
Right.
that kind of is that
Yeah.
what you kind of yeah? Um, I see the point. I think you see that the issue is like whether we actually so is it would you be saying that because we're already undergoing the process of dying that we can understand the um essentially the end of death, like as in what it is, like the possibility of what it means.
Well, that would be
uh
what Heidegger is saying, but I'm also saying that there is a sort of there's a it's not derivative upon that, right? We understand dying,
mhm,
but we also understand death.
right.
That we need sort of both things within our ontology.
You see, because like I remember when I mean, as I say, it's been a while since I've read Heidegger.
Hmm.
um I remember from Heidegger, like the primary thing was is that death seems obviously unmistakably foreign, but then dying doesn't necessarily give you an insight to death, but rather just essentially brings death as a possibility to your horizon. That essentially, like anything which, like for example, a near-death experience will allow someone to understand that death exists as a possibility. It doesn't necessarily like dying would be a separate on a separate aspect of our existence this to death, from what I remember from to Heidegger. Like it
Yeah, yeah,
wouldn't
yeah, yeah.
necessarily, yeah,
Yeah, I
and
agree with that. It's not my death that I'm concerned about. It's the death of others that I'm concerned about, right?
yeah,
So the death of others is basically something that I do think I see, right? So I can't see my own death because by the time I reach that actuality, right? Well, there'd
yeah,
be nothing more to think about. Sure, I understand that. And in a sense, we understand our own death derivatively. But what I'm sort of focused on right here is the death of others. So I do think that there is a sort of sense, maybe a disjunctive sense of where I see some form of Dasein here, or I see some form of human consciousness here, and then the lights go out, and then I can see death right there in front of me, right? Unless you're saying that I see life there, which I don't think I do. So I'm basically asking, what would it mean to not see death, right there in front of me?
well, I think that's the thing. Like, I don't think you see that you like when he makes the distinction between death and lifelessness. I think he really just means that there is a difference between experience and death for the other and experiencing death for oneself. And I think that the difference itself is that ability to perceive what would come after, and that's what forces the angst in the first place, because it forces you into absurdity where it's like, okay, well, this is a meaninglessness now. There is no possibility now that can occur, whilst there is possibility after the death of the other, because you still exist. The possibilities that exist within Dasein have not ceased, and so you're able to contemplate, and so you're not released in this. This is hence people can go and, or they've moved on to heaven, and they start creating notions of theories in which way perhaps these people like still exist, or even that perhaps they don't exist, and so on. But I think that's essentially what separates it for Heidegger. It's essentially the end result and the ability to continue to contemplate with what you've actually observed. Once that ends, that's what's going to force the anxious state.
Yeah, I definitely agree with some of the sort of analysis of um, sort of this existential analysis that Heidegger gives of death and dying and angst and being on to death, right? Those are all
Mm-hmm.
things that I sort of understand, I guess. And I have no problem with those. I guess I just have a general problem with the sort of idea that everything has to be ontologically derivative, or sorry, our understanding has to be sort of derivative from a sort of ontological understanding, right? As Heidegger uses it. So I was just
Yeah.
gonna briefly explain it, I think, to the sort of audience here of what we mean sort of by an ontological instead of an ontic understanding, right? By going towards the present at hand versus the ready at hand distinction, and then also Dasein itself. So he has three types of beings within being and time, and then later on he does an investigation of different types of beings in his later work, right? So like doing the sort of phenomenology or the ontology of technology is something that Heidegger does later in his work. Are you familiar with all of this, by the way? The essence concerning technology, and later on his sort of ontological pluralism.
Not much. No, not really. I know. Obviously, I mean, it depends on like. I mean, it depends on the terminology. If you could just say that again, because I'm not gonna lie. Like, it has been about
Sure.
like 4 years since I've read Heidegger.
So so it seems as though in late Heidegger we do an investigation of different types of beings. In Being and Time,
I will say I am almost exclusively introduced to early Heidegger. I know very little about late Heidegger.
Yeah, that's fine. So the three types of beings, like I said earlier, in Being and Time are being ready at hand, present at hand, and Dasein, right? We do a sort of ontological investigation of all those and what they mean. But then later on, I think we see in Heidegger a sort of movement into doing an investigation of other types of regional forms of ontology, right? So like the essence or ontology of, say, technology. And technology is always something that has in its form sort of a means-end relationship, right? It sort of encapsulates how we move throughout life because it sort of compels us to work within its techne or within its architecture. But at least for Being in Time, so I just give a sort of overview to the audience here, there's three types of beings that Martin Heidegger wants to go over. So he basically thinks that until he did the work Being in Time, that investigation into how we do metaphysics, or ontology rather, is that we've always viewed it in terms of categories, right? We've always viewed it in terms of, say, the Aristotelian categories or the Kantian categories. Everything can be broken up to these few concepts, that is, things like modality, relation, quality, quantity, substance, right? And substance ontology especially is sort of dominating the world. And substance ontology is just sort of a persisting identity that persists and resists over time when we make sense of identity, right? Take, for example, a chair or a tree. There's presumably something about its identity that persists over change, and generally this leads to a favorable substance ontology, right? So within Being and Time, Heidegger is saying, okay, well, there's actually two more unique forms of ontology, right? And that's Dasein at ready at hand. So present at hand are sort of entities like, again, like the tree just standing out there, it having certain types of predicates that we can attach onto it. This tree or this X is Y, right? This is generally how things stand present at hand. They're present in time. They stand out like this right in front of me. Whereas ready at hand, this is a type of ontology or type of investigation that's not going to be quite like that. It's going to say something like, well, the mailbox isn't just standing there right in front of me with these types of properties. It's rather that with which I put my mail in, that which I get my mail from. The door isn't something that's square or rectangular, right? It's something that I pass through. And these forms of ontology, like this form of ontology rather, has a sort of relational context to all these other things, where I wouldn't even say all these other things, but beings, right? They're sort of holistic in the sense that a door relates to its outside, and its outside relates to you, and all these other types of various things or beings relate to each other in a holistic way. And so this ready at handness is going to be a distinct form of ontology from being at hand, or sorry, present at hand. You can go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to give an example of the ready to hand, like present hand distinction. I think like a good example is if you think about riding a bike. It was just for the audience, really. If you think about riding a bike, you'd be you'd be ready to hand. You'd be using the bike as a tool. You would not be considering necessarily the properties of the bike, but you'd be simply concerning yourself with using the bike in its function. In in a present at hand state, you'd be analyzing the bike. Like if you're repairing the bike, you'd probably be present at hand. You'd be thinking about the various properties of the bike, how the bike works, and the mechanisms that actually drive it onwards. If you actually went into the present at hand state when you're pedaling, you probably find it harder to pedal. You'd start thinking, what does it, how do I move my legs? Like, and you know, when someone says to you something stupid like, think of yourself breathing, or like, can you feel the tongue in your mouth? That would be an example of going present in hand about like a ready to hand object, like a ready to hand being. You've essentially moved your horizon, as Heidegger calls it, your awareness, towards a different aspect of that being, which has changed the phenomenological experience of the being. Which is why, like, when you would say, like, can you feel your tongue in your mouth? And then you become aware of, like, you know, the function of your tongue and how to actually move it, or you become aware of your breathing, or if you become aware of how to use a hammer or ride a bike, what you've actually done is you've changed your phenomenological experience in that respect, because you've become aware of various properties of that experience. I was just giving that example. Sorry.
Right. There's a sort of like a almost intuitive or non-inferential form of understanding, I think, in Heidegger when he talks about the sort of ready at handness, right? I mean, but even when we're working with bikes, or say when we're a carpenter, I think Heidegger would say something like, okay, well, the hammer doesn't stand presently as an object that's made of metal, or you know, I think about its various counterfactual possibilities. It stands as that of which I can put in my hand and hammer nails to, right? It has this sort of immediate relational quality to it that stands in relationship to, say, a nail, or me being a carpenter, or me, hammering down a piece of wood somewhere. And
Exactly.
yeah,
And it has a particular relation to Dasein as well in that respect. It's like
right.
the Dasein's relation to both forms of being is very different. Like, as in, if once you kind of migrate from one form to another, it actually changes the way in which you interact with those beings. And I think you're right when you say it's intuitive. Ready to hand is a very intuitive state of being.
Yeah, and then the last form of being that we haven't, I guess, gone through with the audience is Dasein itself. And Dasein is sort of us in a way, right? But not as subjects, qua subjectivity, because then he thinks that this is sort of affiliated with a project of Descartes, right? Going to the cogito, talking about a mind and mental states that are somehow encapsulated in a certain type of spatial area, right? He calls this a sort of cabinet of consciousness. Instead, he wants to think that whatever a human being is, as a Dasein, is so interwoven with the world that we can't separate it from the world. And
Yeah.
Daseins are kind of unique compared to any other type of being, in the sense that they can contemplate themselves, they can reflect upon themselves, they can attune themselves to the world, they have care for the world, right? Things.
Yeah, I was going to say cares. I think the
Yes.
word he uses, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and this sort of relationship of care is unique, right? I mean, an object obviously can't go into, say, like Kroger or hospital, to where any of that will make sense to, a hammer or a rock or whatever, an object. But a human being obviously can enter Kroger, and they all uniquely see certain types of things within Kroger that sort of stand in relation to them as Daseins, right? They attune themselves and they care for it in certain types of weird ways. Like if you go to a baby aisle, right, in Walmart or something like that, obviously if you're a parent, that's going to stand in relation to you in a unique and distinct way. How I reveal myself as a Dasein to, say, my child is different from how I'm going to reveal myself as a teacher. And in this sense, Dasein always hides and reveals itself in different types of ways. It's this sort of unique ontology to it.
Yeah, and I think Dasein is sheer possibility. It is from what it exists. At least that's how I've interpreted it. It has nothing other than a care for its own ontological investigation. When it comes to the ontology of Dasein, or the ontic, like the ontic reality of Dasein, I would say, from what I don't know if you would agree, from my understanding of Heidegger, it is possibility itself.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. So I think it has, again, a dimension of like investigating futural types of events, right? It has a sort of concern for itself, and concern for itself is always future orientated, right? So that's just talking about what Heidegger calls the ecstasies, or the ecstatic form of of Dasein, right? It's predominantly in the future. Sometimes it's in the past. Sometimes it's caught up with the past, right? This is just how human beings act. But it's not just mere future possibilities. It also has an actuality. It first has to be. It also has to have, and in virtue of it being, it has a facticity, right? So I don't know if it's just completely ahead of itself, running past itself and from its present, but it certainly does have that aspect to it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I find Heidegger very interesting. I do. I do think that I could definitely read more Heidegger. Like, I definitely need to. I think obviously, I end up getting caught up in everything else. Reading like various other thinkers, and I always know that I need to go back because I feel like he's got a lot of value to unpack. I think the issue I have with Heidegger, to be honest, I think he's quite right with saying how caught up we are in the world. I think that he's quite right in that, but I think that necessarily, it seems that his rejection of Descartes is almost an inversion. It's almost as if that's why I was trying to say like an out rather than start inside out, he starts outside in, as if like all of being exists in such a way that there isn't a private state within the individual. And I think that like that's very possible, but I think necessarily his account of it, I'm not wholly convinced of, like in terms of like Dasein and Dasein's relation to being. But then that might simply be my own, as I say, ignorance towards like the depth of Heidegger, because there is quite a lot of Heidegger, and I do need to read more late Heidegger, who, from what I'm aware, radically changes his views.
Yeah.
I mean, you could tell us more. From what I'm aware, like he almost rejects being in time, like a lot of being in time.
Well, I don't know too much about late Heidegger either. I know a little bit, in the sense that I think he thinks that being in time is a sort of transcendental project. And by transcendental project, I just mean something like Kant's project, that we're trying to find the conditions of possibility for such and such, and particularly what Daseins are, right? What are the sort of conditions, or what makes possible the idea of talking about Dasein and its relationship and its various types of relationships to the world, right? And this, or any sort of transcendental project that I see, seems to sort of needs to be sort of jettisoned as a whole, I think, for late Heidegger, and as well the sort of narrow scope of the different types of ontologies that he's investigated in being in time seem to also be jettisoned in favor of the more broad kind of ontological pluralism, if I was to use analytic terminology. And that's just because, we can do a sort of analysis of technology. If you've read like the Frankfurt School, for example, someone like Marcuse, right? We're doing a sort of phenomenology or an ontology of technology. Or if we're, say, reading someone like Ivan Ilyich, right? We're doing a sort of phenomenology of schools. And it doesn't seem like this sort of ends, right? There seems to be a sort of bottomless pit, or sort of bottomless analysis of different types of regional ontologies that we can investigate. And kind of, I think, Husserl also saw this when he said that, we can investigate the mind, we can investigate physical things, but we can also investigate cultures, right? And those seem to have a sort of distinct way of talking about them. So yeah, I mean, that would be sort of where I'd see late Heidegger going into. But
I heard a quite nice little anecdote actually about Heidegger, and when he was much older and he had like retreated essentially to his like isolation for the most part. Apparently, one of his friends, I can't remember who it was, went to visit him, and he was reading a book by Suzuki, like a book on Zen Buddhism, and apparently he turned to his friend and said, "If I'm understanding this man correctly, he's saying what I've been trying to say my entire life."
Right.
So that I think that's quite a radical change from like being in time. So it's quite like an interesting way of thinking that like perhaps like it may be worth thinking of maybe late Heidegger as something akin phenomenologically to a Buddhist, which is I probably would be very interested in.
Yeah, I've definitely heard that quote as well. I think it's sort of interesting. I haven't read too much Eastern philosophy, unfortunately. Western philosophy has consumed me wholly, so I've only read a little bit. a little bit in
So
that
look,
area.
I was going to say I've only done I've done like Buddhist ethics. I actually really do enjoy Buddhist ethics. I think it's very interesting. I think they make mistakes in terms of like like I guess my biggest critique would be and I think like we can interpret this many ways. So depending upon how we interpret how Buddhists mean this, is when Buddhists say there is no such thing as the self. I think Hegel would turn around and say the exact opposite. Actually, no, you're wrong. All there is the self. And I think that's probably where me and Buddhism would probably have an issue. But I think it depends on what the Buddhists mean by self. If they mean identity in terms of the I, then what they're really talking about is the limits of our self awareness. And I think that then that opens very much so up to Hegel, in which he's kind of saying that the grounding of being or in being, and that what we are is holistically being, which means that, and then obviously Buddhists talk about this almost idea of transcendence, as if we still exist once we've destroyed ourselves and we transcend into a higher form of existence, and it's almost as if we are being itself. And I think maybe that's almost like the Buddhist understanding, and is a destruction of our egoistical kind of conception of reality in this form of individualistic I, and an understanding of holistic being, perhaps. But then obviously it depends on what interpretation you kind of take upon yourself. And then obviously you've got the various different forms of Buddhism, like you've got Zen, Mahayana, and Theravada, and whether they're all holding the same metaphysical account is a question in of itself. And I'm not a scholar in this point. I'm not reading that many accounts of Buddhism, but I did find Buddhist ethics very interesting. I think that virtue ethicists, for the most part, like I think very similar anyway.
What about your own ethical stances? I mean, like, what type of ethical theory would you say that you subscribe yourself to?
In terms of meta-ethics, normative ethics, kind of, I would say that meta-ethically, I'd say mostly I'm a Hegelian, like in terms of everything. I think it kind of sums up a lot of my positions. Like when we talk about Brandom inferentialism, I think that I find that very compelling. And I think when you talk about like for those like obviously who aren't familiar with Hegel, when it comes to meta-ethics with Hegel, there is a grounding essentially in being for ethics, in the understanding of ourselves. That ethics itself is an equality between the recognition of individuals. And I find that incredibly compelling, because it shows that the epistemology of every single field is essentially dependent upon an ethical relation between two individuals and some presuppositions, which is why, let's say, like, the continental view of free will would be to dismiss causal notions of well, the atypical continental view. I shouldn't say continental because it's not that simple. But the atypical continental view of free will is to dismiss causal notions of humanity as being, like, for example, that they create in psychology, because they would say that these are unfitting concepts, because you'd have to presume an understanding of self that would essentially breach the ethical relationship between individuals. And so essentially the epistemology would have to precede the ethics, and that seems to not make sense, because epistemology seems to be the result of ethics. And if anyone's interested in that kind of thing, there's actually a book written by David Rose called Continental Philosophy and Free Will, which essentially shows like sort of the existential account within continental philosophy towards free will, and this focus on existentialism. I'd say that's where I kind of rely as well. I would say that an existential account of man is more compelling. I don't think that when we talk about essence, we're kind of are losing the very foundations of being. But then I think Hegel kind of unifies essence and an existence in a very neat package, where like we no longer have this like almost Sartrean self-destruction where we need to be Brahman if we're to be free, almost, although that depends on how we read Sartre. And we can have a notion of our essence which is still wrong, a fundamental human nature from which we do not understand, and this human nature itself is derivative from our, existential existence. And it's this. I really feel like Hegel really manages to put these two together in a neat little package where you kind of understand, like self-understanding is a part of why of the possibility of our existence. Essentially, when we are moving through existence, we're trying to uncover possibility, and when we try to understand our possibilities, we create essence as a fundamental explanation for ourselves, which never seem to perfectly fit, but in so much that they actually are ourselves. This essence, the content of our thoughts, is the thinking, and the thinking and the thoughts cannot be removed from one another. So the eventual essence of our existence is essentially the unification of the self thinking of itself, which is, I think, really, really interesting. And I say that's essentially the metaphysical and meta-ethical foundations of my thought. Moving on to normative explanations, in this kind of remain in this Hegelian sort of way, I would say that Hegel kind of sees ethics as an institutional process. And so we don't individualistically, think about what is right and wrong in an almost Kantian, what is my duty? I will rationalize my way towards it from A, deductively from A to B. Instead, deductive reasoning in this respect is institutional. It exists between individuals and is practiced between individuals. So ethics itself is institutional. And so what we do is when we try to work out, the ends or the duties that we have, the first thing I think is, like, if we were to contrast it with the Kantian account, our duties are not individually given. We cannot understand our duties in relation to application of reason alone. We need cultural context and conceptual frameworks which exist within communities and overall human practices in order to uncover like what our duties should be. So there is a deontological aspect, but that is ultimately in relation to everyone's goal, which is towards positive experiences and happiness. I think even Kant says the rational goal for all what does he say, the goal of all rational beings is happiness. And I think it's something that, like, Hegel essentially agrees with his notion of desire. Desire is moving us towards essentially an expression of positive being. And so there is this consequential view, but it's so abstract, it's not able to be understood either. Like, both the Kantian view, which is the abstract duty, and the utilitarian view, which is the abstract concept, consequence, are both unintelligible to individuals for Hegel. And so instead, what we have is duties which inherently relate to our very being, to our end, to a telos within humanity, within the rational being. And so what you have is we create duties in order to construct lives which best reflect the expression of subjectivity within agents, or the freedom of the will. And so you have what essentially a threshold deontology, or a deontological account within institutions which ultimately reflects the ultimate good of all agents. And I would say that's probably where I would agree with as well. And I think there's a really great paper, if anyone's interested, on the application of deontology and consequentialism within Hegel, written by Dean Moyer. So yeah.
So if I'm not sure if I quite understand everything there. I am not too familiar with Hegelian ethics. It's something that I'm also doing some research in, within this notion that Hegelian ethics do seem to be sort of intersubjective. They do seem to be institutionalized to some extent. I mean, like, the concept of right might be something that's fundamentally, like, societal, right? It doesn't just come about from thin air.
It's very much culturally and socially embedded. It cannot be divorced from that.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit. So I don't know. I guess I'm somewhat reluctant towards that, because it seems as though that gets into a form of constructivism, right? That there seems to be something. I mean, that ethics seem to be sort of constructed instead of something that's already out there being real, and that's the sort of thing that I'm against, I guess, when it comes to the German idealist tradition. It's like within Kant, right? The good or the practical reason seems to be something that's constitutive of the agent itself. Is that really a direction that you want to kind of take it in, like a form of constructivism, or like, you know, constitutivism?
I think the beautiful thing with Hegel is that it's not like purely like linguistic, like a linguistic construction or anything like that. Like in this respect, like in like for example, when we talk about Robert Brandom and inferentialism, um, Hegel understands, and I think I agree with Brandom in this aspect, especially that Hegel would understand the very notion of having an ethical investigation in the first place shows the possibility that it will actually adhere, that there is in fact and if he talks about modal logic, Brandom, because obviously he's an analytic. He essentially talks about, even in modal logic, that there must be the possibility that, you know, P actually obtains P. Because if P didn't obtain P in any case, and there was no possibility of it, then we're talking nonsense. Logic doesn't apply. So because it's a logical form, P must actually have the possibility of obtaining. Now, Hegel, when he talks about ethics, kind of shows that there is this fundamental investigation into, you know, what ethics will bring around the fundamental positivity of our existence, and or avoid the negativity of our existence. And I feel like Hegel is far more true to the classical notion of ethics as being a continuous action. It's not like he's not using ethics as like or morality as a noun, right? So Hegel actually has to draw a distinction between morality and ethics, because morality become known as a noun, as something that, like, you know, like an ideal, as something to be understood. Well, Hegel then says, well, that's not what it's about. We're talking about ethics, and we talk about fundamentally like notions of right, how I should behave. And that's kind of what Hegel's getting at. It's like, as if when we talk about notions of good, he would probably point towards that as being an undeniable aspect of our being. He'd be like, of course, there are positive and negative experiences in relation to desire. That is undeniable. You cannot deny desire, and desire relates to the expression of subjectivity and the will, which is undeniable. And so he would say 100%, like, that is an aspect of being itself. Like, it is ontologically, like, it is real. Like, it is undeniable. Now, now I would say moreover that when he talks about, like when we move on to like our inferences in relation to ethics and how to achieve certain behaviors and whether we're making the right choices, what he's actually saying there is that sometimes our inferences are wrong and sometimes they're right. And what we are doing is investigating the ontology of what we are, of being, in order to uncover which is right or wrong. In this sense, like, is this concept correct against reality? And it's almost as if like it follows almost the scientific method. And actually, the philosophy of right, like, and Hegel is incredibly scientific. Like, that's basically what he wants to be. He just wants to turn everything into like a science, and this is deductive format in which we constantly test everything and constantly move through epistemologically. And so when I say that, I think Hegel would outright just deny into subjectivism. He would not say that. It would be like, that is nonsense. And I think if you took, like, if you were to show Hegel Wittgenstein, you'd be like, he's half right. Like, and I think that's essentially what Brandom does with Hegel. He kind of goes, well, Wittgenstein's made some really great points about how language functions, about how we understand being, and how we understand various concepts within the world. But he doesn't understand that it's like, he sees it as the creation of the world. That is absolutely wrong. It's simply our understanding of the world. And that's essentially where I would say, like, Hegel would kind of put what ethical institutions. He'd be like, well, ethical institutions are simply a reflection of being. It is the content of our thoughts, but they're not adequately capable of understanding.
Right.
It's understanding
Right.
itself.
So yeah. So the way that I'm hearing this, right, is that culture, or maybe spirit or zeitgeist, whatever you kind of want to form it, some form of institutions, is going to sort of be the medium or maybe the vehicle in which it's on which we're going to understand, I guess, the good in itself, right? It's going to be some sort of medium in which helps us unpack the good, kind of like the mind helps us unpack truth in itself, right? And this
Yeah, I mean,
seems to be, be incremental, right? As we go throughout history, there's more and more of what it means to sort of unpack the good.
as well, it's less than understanding the ontology of good and more understanding the ontology of ourselves who experience good. So because we are continuously trying to behave in the world and act within the world, it becomes a verb. And this is why we get notions of right. And I think that's where like Hegel kind of primarily focuses his notion of spirit, because it's like when we are trying to understand how we behave, he basically says that like this expression of subjectivity would almost be annihilated at the end of in absolute spirit. If we had absolute knowledge of ourselves, we wouldn't have to think of how to act. We no longer need it. It's basically intuitive. We could pretty much be in a permanent, ready-to-hand state, if you were to use a Heideggerian term, because there would be no need to contemplate how we should behave in the future. And he sees this as kind of like the end of reason, like almost as if like reason is almost like function is it's not an intrinsic good, but it's essentially like reason is essentially the mechanism to obtain the right behaviors which would lead us towards living the good life. The good life is not what we investigate, as in like the good of the life is not what we investigate in terms of like what is the good and what is its form and its infinitesimal ontological perfection. It's rather like how do we obtain that which it is, and that is the purpose of ethics. And I think that's very close to like the Greek notions of ethics, of it being like ethikos, in behaviors.
I think I understand what you're trying to say. This sort of reminds me of because I have read Hegel's Aesthetics, and I mean I guess you sort of see this historical turn of consciousness as something that's sort of developing instead of necessarily in stasis or internal. And he does the same thing with in logic and ontology, right? That our
Yeah,
understanding is not something that has these sort of internal Platonic forms, but rather is in tension with itself. It's building concepts dialectically and through opposition and tension and strife. And this does
this
seem,
is why.
yeah,
Sorry.
this, yeah, no, this does seem to sort of go back into this kind of Greek idea of, I guess, the philosophy of becoming, right? And this is generally what I see in,
Absolutely.
yeah, this is what I generally see in later German idealism, is that knowledge or understanding isn't going to reach some sort of absolute closure at this point or at this point or at this point. It's rather that something that's going to be dialectically progressing. And so this is how I think he sort of retains, like, say, a scientific realism, or maybe, as you say, a sort of ethical realism, in that approximations, right, don't necessarily have to be false. They just have to be approximations of how the actual world is. And approximations are always preserved once you find the error in them, and then you get to the later truth, right? So on and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
This is exactly it. I mean, becoming is essentially what we are for Heidegger. Like we are being and nothingness, and that is essentially what essentially we fundamentally are. We are a fundamental state of becoming, for Hegel rather. I keep saying Heidegger because of that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's essentially what we are for Hegel. Very much so. I think he really goes through this in the logic. Like, if anyone wants to punish themselves a lot, read The Science of Logic. You're gonna love it.
Yeah.
um, it's horrible, but it's incredibly. It's probably one of his most useful works. I'd say The Science of Logic, especially when he talks about the idea of like the content of logic is essentially logic itself. Like as if logic is inseparable from our attributation of signifiers to reality and to the content of our thoughts. So to say that some P is P, it is the expression of logic, and that expression of logic is logic. It's not like a separate law which impacts us. It is our very thinking. And then, like, that pops up later on in people like Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein seems to make kind of a distinction, and I think Wittgenstein says like Hegel was interested in saying everything is the same, and I'm interested in saying that everything is different. And then in this way, Wittgenstein's wrong. At least I would argue so, and I think that's probably what Robert Brandom would say. It's almost as if he misses the intrinsic holistic nature of being. But it's important as well to like differentiate Hegelian idealism in this form of spirit from like Kantian idealism and other forms of idealism within continental philosophy, which basically use a state of apprehension as the fundamental nature of what unifies reality. That essentially that it is subjectivity and a pure subjective state that unifies, you know, ideals. That everything that exists in your mind is essentially the evidence and the fundamental nature of why being is unified in a non-physical realm. And the funny thing is that Hegel kind of takes this apart and basically says this is absolute nonsense, because this relies upon the fundamental connection of determinate beings, which ultimately exists in almost a form of empirical analysis in which you must relate these beings to each other, and their relation to each other is what you prove through apprehension, quote unquote, as the fundamental nature of your being. So you relied upon two contradictory modes of explanation to essentially unify being, and you end up in absurdity.
Now, there's in relation to this, there's a sort of question that I think is sort of perplexing that always gets us back into maybe a form of transcendental idealism instead of a absolute idealism, and it's a sort of hard question. So if you don't know the answer, that's fine. But I mean, I guess
I don't know a lot answer for a lot of things, so don't worry.
Yeah. So so there's always people, right, who are going to be like, say, new Mysterianists. It's the sort of movement of generally a form of that the mind and body are sort of mysteriously connected, and we won't get to it. And there are also going to be people who just don't think that we have complete epistemic access to all of the world, right? They're going to, in some way, say, well, like, let's look at a cat's mind, right? And a cat, if you present him, say, and this is one of my friends brought this up to me earlier, if you present a laptop to them, the cat's not going to know what the laptop means, right? An ant is not going to know if you, say, have your shoe right above its head, that it's about to be squished by a shoe, because it has no concept of what a shoe is. So there could likewise be, you know, some sort of cognitive limitations to what a mind is and what it can do and how much it can actually grasp of the world, right? And furthermore, because of these sorts of cognitive limitations, some would also say like that the mind and body relation is fundamentally mysterious. I was wondering if you had like any sort of objection to those two things that I just mentioned, one of Mysterianism and the first one of epistemic limitations that kind of like bring us back into transcendental philosophy, like Kant's, or are you sort of agnostic?
So like when we come to like understand like the cat's mind in a Kant, let's say if you use Kantian terminology, you'd say that the cat's mind would be something like the noumena, an unreachable form of being which exists entirely separate from absolute spirit, and so contradicts the Hegelian notion of being grounded within this relation with the other. Well, I think there's two things to be said there. I think that the fact that I don't think that it exists inseparably. I think that if anything, Hegel would probably say, no, we could, like, it is accessible. If we don't have the tools to access it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's unknowable, like as in metaphysically impossibly unknowable. Like it's just more of the fact that like it just means that we don't have the right technology necessarily to investigate it, and let's say like aspects of our mind are still in terms of each other are still hidden. The only difference is if we're looking to a Lacanian kind of explanation of it, we can see that when we operate together, open ourselves up as being able to understand ourselves through our enunciations and its interpretation with the other, which opens up the possibility of subconscious analysis. which would have otherwise been, unavailable to us. So it's not as if like the language would then have operated as a technology which has then disclosed an aspect of our being. That's not to say that that aspect of our being is unknowable just because, let's say, if we didn't speak, for example, it's not that being didn't have the possibility of being known, because clearly it does, because we've learned to know it, but rather that we simply did not have the means to know it. And I think that that distinction needs to be drawn, between the unknowable and the unknown. When you look at it, when you talk about like a cat's mind and whether it would be private, I think that it would be opposite, like absolutely opposite. I think that Hegel would probably say that it would be public, at least the possibility of being public, just just the same as a Wittgensteinian sense, where it have the possibility of being public as being able to, have conceptualization, which can then understand our own minds.
So,
for example,
so let's slowly break that down just for a second for the audience sake of what you mean by a cat's mind being public. So I'm presumably there's some sort of, you don't mean that we have literal access into the thoughts of a cat as the cat has thoughts of its own mind, right? You mean something like whatever type of intentional content that cat has seems to be publicly displayed in some sort of fashion, right?
And also Hegel would probably, I think, would probably say that the cat itself is having an experience, having a content of its mind, which is being experienced, and so that it is actually being understood by something, at least in a intuitive sense, maybe not in a deep sense, in the sense that it's not like, it might be able to create inferences which then understand itself, but it would be experienced. And being experienced is essentially the fundamental nature of being. It's not the understanding of being which is being itself. It is simply the experience of being, which is the fundamental essence of being, which is why it's existential. And in that respect, when I talk about the cats being public, it's intuitable by the cat, and then two, even if you were to teach let's say the cat to speak, I know that's almost nonsensical, but if you would teach the cat to speak, there would be meanings attributable to the experiences of the cat, meaning that the experiences of the cat have the possibility of being understood, that inferences could be obtained, and the cat could gain self-awareness if it had the mechanism of language. Of course, it doesn't. It's a cat, but that doesn't mean the being is unknowable and unreachable in a Kantian sort of noumena sense.
Yeah, noumenal.
Yeah, noumenal. Thanks.
Yeah. No problem. So yeah, but there seems to be, and I kind of, I guess there's a few things that I wanted to say there. One, I think the sort of distinction between the unknowable and the unknown is sort of important, but I guess inviting in a certain level of skepticism that it is quite possible that something might be in principle unknowable. And I think there's certain types of logical paradoxes that also sort of demonstrate these, and I don't know the solution to them, like Fichte's paradox of knowability.
Well, this is the thing. Like, I think I think like a lot of the paradoxes. I think, what does Hegel say? He says a contradiction exists only in our minds and not in nature. So when he thinks that there is like a paradox or something like that, it is essentially that we have not explained it properly, and that's when he takes like something like Zeno's paradox and he's like, "Right, this is wrong." Unfortunately, like, there are paradoxes that are yet to be solved, but that would, I think, for Hegel, be expressed in a limitation in our logic. It's the fact that we haven't solved it shows that our logic has not reached perhaps even reached the possibility of solving it. That's not to say that it's like absolutely like forever unsolvable, but that like in our current way of thinking, we would be incapable of solving it. And then this opens up a whole myriad of like ethical like points to be made. Like, and this is why Hegel like sees ethics as a progression, because the ethical concepts one has available essentially determine what inferences one can make in relation to how we should live our lives. And so like when someone like Foucault says, ancient man, like, was it like ancient Christians couldn't have been anything, couldn't have rejected slavery, Hegel would have agreed. He would have been like, absolutely, like it was a necessary experience, a necessary ethical format for that culture. and as it develops, it'll be shown to be incorrect in relation to the expression of subjectivity. And he uses slavery as an example of something which is absolutely rejectable as and absolutely abhorrent. But he would absolutely have said that, like, you know, the ancient, like, the, you know, ancient Chinese, they're not gonna be able to go like, all right, well, slavery's wrong, and so is our hierarchical systems, and so on. He would essentially said that this is an expression of lordsman, bondsman, lordship bondsman relationship, or as we know it now, master slave morality, which is essentially progressing through time as we work towards an equality between through agents and their ability to recognize each other as equally capable of verifying and falsifying each other's claims.
Right, right. I was going to say something earlier, but I kind of lost the thought now originally.
I think you were talking about the other aspect of, I think you were talking about the mind-body
Oh,
connection.
oh yeah.
Um,
Not only that. Well, I guess before we get onto that, so you don't think that? I mean, it's perhaps possible that, um, there are no complete unknowables. But I mean, it certainly seems likely, at least if you think that the mind is related to evolution in some sort of way, that there is a sort of there might be a sort of evolutionary limitation there, or there might be a certain limit in terms of our our life sort of running out. I mean, what would you say to that? There's going to be certain types of limitations or cognitive limitations due to evolutionary reasons.
hello, hello.
Yeah, you there?
Yeah, sorry. Like my sound cut off of almost that entire thing. Just
Oh,
I'm having problems with me. I'm having problems with my headphones. I'm really sorry. What did you say? I'm really sorry.
I was relating consciousness and cognitive limitations to evolutionary explanations. So if you think consciousness is related to evolution, and I'm actually sort of agnostic to that. I'm not sure if evolution can completely account for, at least current theories of evolution, I don't think can account for consciousness. But if it does have some sort of relation there, there would be certain types of cognitive limitations because of evolution. Or
Yeah.
would you reject those as well?
Well, what I would say is that it's an epistemological impossibility to explain causally consciousness in terms of one's own consciousness, and like therefore consciousness in as a universal. I think that's essentially what Hegel would probably say. I think in relation to it as well, like it wouldn't be that, like, and it's not necessarily even say it's essentially that something that is unknowable would be the impossible rather would be to explain how consciousness actually works and develops. If you were to say that the, you know, evolution in terms of can explain, if we're talking about like a biological link towards consciousness, and that consciousness is inherently tied to the brain, fair enough. I don't think Hegel would have a problem with that. Like, you know, it, like, as in like the mind being related to the body in terms of like neurological like experiences. If you were to say like right, well, I can trigger these neurological experiences by I can trigger neurological, I can trigger like a mental experience of X by doing, you know, Y within the brain. Like, I think Hegel probably would have a problem with that. um but they exist purely in relation within this epistemological framework. Like, it would be the essence of man, but the essence itself is produced after the existence, which has led to this ethical relation and epistemological relationship, which has allowed them to be investigated. So you couldn't go before that, if you understand what I'm saying. Um, but then when you say, like, you know, in relation to the evolutionary account of man, it depends on what you mean. Do you mean like unknowable, as in there would be something essentially related to the consciousness of an individual which would be unobtainable by another, as in like what it is to experience life as you versus life as me, because essentially we could have a variation. For example, you could have um, an inverted color, was it a color axis or whatever, and then you'd be experiencing, you know, what is it like was it red as purple, and so on like that. Um,
I will answer that question in just a second. I'll be right back, just for a moment, if you can.
Oh yeah, absolutely, of course. Yeah, I mean, essentially, for anyone obviously who's interested, what I was essentially going to say is that we could talk about the experience of qualia, and I think that it's qualia itself. Um, it's not something that is essentially investigated. It's something that is essentially understood inherently. Now, would Hegel say that that is like private and unknowable? Um, in the sense that it is experienced, um, it's hard to say. I think that what he would say is that the knowledge itself is produced by the experience of qualia and not about the experience of qualia. And that what you're trying to do is explain the experience in the first place. So like you're trying to create an explanation and a causal understanding of what it means to experience. And he's like, you've got it the wrong way around. You experience and then you deduce from those experiences, aspects of what those experiences are. But the experiences themselves, like what it is to experience, is not something that can be understood. That is essentially being itself, and you cannot go beyond that. So like everything has to exist in this in within being. Um, being itself being the ultimate manifest, like the ultimate reality. Like the unification of all idea, and idea itself is something which is existentially precedent from any knowledge claims that could be functional. So when you create, let's say, like an inference in relation to something, and let's say, like what it means to experience red, what you'd be doing is, I think you'd be making an epistemological error. You'd be essentially saying that red is something you'd be trying to you'd be trying to manifest an experience of red rather than trying to explain experience of red. So that's essentially what I'm trying to get at. I don't know if I'm right in explaining Hegel on this. I think I might be. I'm not sure, but it's certainly something that I could definitely do more reading in. Yeah. So I'll give a recap for that. Essentially, what I was saying is I think there's like, and that one would be making an epistemological error if we try and explain like the quality of our experience, like essentially experience itself. That's not what Hegel's trying to do. Like he's not trying to say that we can induce an experience of red. That like if I was to produce the right words, then I would essentially give you the experience of red. Um, on the contrary, he would say that the words themselves are reflections of those experiences of red, that the thinking is thinking of its experience of red. It's not that we are inducing an experience of red. It's not that red isn't, and your experience of it is like an unknowable reality. In fact, it is knowable in the sense that it is that experience which allows us to create the concept of red. If you were to say that your existence is independent and your experience itself is independent, then yes, but that's what it means to be the other, and that's why you're an infinite. Although I do think that we do unify absolutely through consciousness. I think in Hegel's Absolute Spirit, at the end of Absolute Spirit, whether he's right or not, I'm not certain, and I'm not sure if this necessarily explains Hegel necessarily. Like, would I be able to understand your experience of red? Absolutely. Um, I'm not sure, but I think we'd be making an epistemological error if we thought that I could induce an experience within you, which would essentially, or you could induce an experience within me, or absolute knowledge of an experience within, said infinites,
I
because he
don't
says that
know.
essentially ties with between three infinite metaphysical. I think it's three metaphysical aspects of what being, and essentially there's me, you, and we're common, domain in space, and
Mhm.
each of which are infinitely kind of unknowable in their absolute sense, but they're not unknowable, quote unquote. They're just yet to be known. and that we haven't developed the right conceptual framework to transmit this information. And I think that you probably just turn around and say that it's not that like, and I think this is maybe me extrapolating a bit, it's not that necessarily that your experience of red is unknowable. I mean, perhaps a past experience of red is unknowable, like as in that it's no longer present and no longer actually existent. But let's say your current experience is unknowable. It's that it's unknowable in the sense that I lack the framework to understand you correctly, to experience it with you in this absolute being.
So just to add a little bit more to on that, since I guess you're talking about qualia and then sort of experience of red, or the qualia of red, or the qualia of sort of anything. And when I checked the sort of analytic interpretation of that, since they were the only ones that really use the word qualia, I don't really see that often used.
I'm just stealing analytic terminology for that.
I recall Brandom and McDowell both being actually eliminativists about qualia, and I think rightfully so, because if we look at like, and this is just something I think I've thought about only a little bit, but if we think about certain types of thought experiments about qualia, like Mary's room, well, presumably after experiencing red, there's something new on top of the propositional knowledge that generates some sort of understanding of red, right? She experiences red, and presumably, even though she had all the information about red, she learned something new. But that's just to say, I think, that there's a species of understanding that isn't propositional in content, which seems to be what Hegel seems to reject, right? And qualia seems to have like this subjective, non-relational,
I think you're probably right.
Irreducible,
Like,
irreducible quality to it, and that I think is wrong. Right. Yeah, I think that seems wrong, right? Because that seems as though there is something that's incommunicable or ineffable about our experiences, and I don't think Hegel would say something like that. I think he would just say like, okay, well, the world is qualitative, right? But just everything that we talk about seems qualitative, right? I mean, everything has that type of content to it. There doesn't seem to be anything unique about that.
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to express with like qualia, really, I think was just the experience as it's experienced. I wasn't trying to infer like an absolute private like kind of domain.
Yeah.
But I do think that Hegel would agree that it's essentially at base level sense certainty. And that like essentially like he would reject sense certainty as being an actual form of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But that like that is the foundation of knowledge itself, and that's kind of like what I was trying to get at in a way anyway, is like the experience itself is inherently informative of of the concepts in which we use, that all of these are essentially informing us and are being gathered in essentially one place, absolute spirit, to form concepts which apply to reality, which then divest reality and allow us to understand, aspects of our experience. For example, I think I brought this up in the Cosmic Skeptic conversation I had with him, like when I was in his sort of what you call studio, like he had like this wallpaper up, and I talked about like what it means to experience like like gold and stuff like that, and I said like, well, you wouldn't have the experience of gold until you had the word to divest that experience from the rest of like your base sensual experience. You'd have the experience of the color, and like you could see it, but then it wouldn't be gold. Like that, what we talk about as gold is essentially a particular color that we've not abstracted, but like negated the rest of these objects. And that's why Hegel goes from sense certainty to the negation of sense certainty, which is like empiricism, determinate objects existing in relation to one another.
So let's go over sense certainty real quick from the phenomenology of spirit for the audience, right? And unpack exactly what you mean by sense certainty before we continue.
So yeah, I mean, like if we take like sense certainty, it would be literally your perception. Like as in like your most basic unconceptualized perception of reality, as in the colors, the senses, the feelings of reality itself, the raw sense datum is sense certainty.
Yeah. And To me, it seems like he would be actually rejecting this very notion, right?
Well, he wouldn't reject sense datum. He would just say that that itself is not the end of inquiry. Like, he'd be like, being is not purely perceived, it's understood. But that data is essentially the fundamental essence of experience. Like, it's not as if we go like for example, like if you were to draw inferences like from what Hegel kind of builds up from, he builds up from sense certainty and sense data onwards to describe absolute being. And it's not that he's describing something that is not a conscious experience of sensual reality or like perceivable reality. Of course he is. He's like being is being perceived by agents who are actually like conscious beings. And that's what consciousness is. It's an experience. It is a content which is being experienced. It's just simply not all sense data. Which is why you talk like the sort of he goes beyond like sense data and starts talking about the relationship between beings as empirically, and that leads to an understanding of like an abstract physical reality which is separate from the individual. And then he talks about how all of those relate to an apprehension which shows that empiricism to be wrong, because all the beings are only given meaning in relation to yourself. And he kind of builds this up from there. And it's a I mean, if anyone wants to go and read the dialectic he performs in the first part of the Phenomenology of Spirit, it is really interesting. Because he even takes it from there and he keeps going, and he doesn't seem to end actually. He kind of like a bit confused and lost a lot of the time, and you just have to read things over and over again. At least I did anyway. I don't know if that's just my experience of reading Hegel, but my God. And anyway, like, so the point I'm kind of trying to get at is that when he's saying that like this quality of the sense datum, if you were to see that like it like that is itself something to be known, and like the sense datum of what we do is investigate that like ontology, that metaphysical reality, and like we do that through inferential on an inferential basis. We create thesis, antithesis, and then synthesize them as we constantly come to know the greater depths of our reality. Now, I think Hegel, when he talks about the other, being able to inform us of our own experiences of reality, but then also being an experience of our own reality, it's not as if the other is even separate anyway. So I think there isn't a Hegelian aspect that could just deny, as if that the other would be that like the other has another experience of red, that we don't know about. And you could just say like, well, what the other does is exist for us in an aspect of our own experience, and because we exist in the self, which is probably one of like a Hegelian kind of unity is within the self, and that's one way to do it. But I think you could say that Hegel would be able to say that we would be eventually able to create inferences which accurately describe, in relation to ourselves, these experiences. But like, for example, could you teach a blind person to see through inferences? Like, can I give you what it means to have this sense datum? I don't think Hegel would say you could. But I don't think that he would necessarily say that that it's like an impossible, unreachable realm, as it's unknowable.
Because I tend to take.
I think he would basically say that it wasn't part of the realm anyway, because it goes beyond being, as in like the self.
I tend to think that the sort of aspect of sense certainty is something that's later repudicated within the rest of the phenomenology of spirit, right? It's like this thing that we think that we see, but it's actually ends up being loaded with conceptual content, right? And it's always being we always come to the world through mediation. And I tend to think that when we have, and I was saying this earlier in the stream, when we have perceptual experiences, right, there is no such thing as sense data in terms of some sort of non-conceptual, immediately given content that's just out there within the sort of, to use Kantian terminology, a manifold of different types of things
Well,
but
he kind of does say that there is, because he does this in a very like it's a nothingness, it's an abyss. It's not as if it's like a determinate object,
yeah, well,
but rather
I
that it's a
can,
here and a now.
yes,
It's a universal that's
yes,
applied to
yes.
what we're experiencing. Sorry.
No, no, absolutely. There is a sense of where it's indeterminate, but that's not. And you recognize the concept of. I mean, even in the logic, you sort of understand the concept of nothingness and being as it is in its indeterminate and immediate sense. It's sort of unpack that for the viewers, right? It's immediate in the sense that um, you're not mediating it. You're not using the mind to think of anything or introduce certain types of concepts in order to understand this whatever it is that we're talking about.
I think
and
he
and
uses the
and,
word
and
imminent as well.
yeah, and indeterminate. Sure, yeah, we could go over the word imminent as
No,
well,
no,
but
I know. It's just I just mean like that there is that like it like when I was saying like that sense datum and like that like fully like that experienced reality. I would say that that's what he means when he says imminent. Imminent reality. But you're right in saying that anything that in which we like say gold, like when I was talking about colors, or I talk about any determinate object within that relation, is the application of a concept.
right. And I was also going to explain indeterminate in the sense that we have no what's the word? We have no concept, right? We have no concept to contrast another concept. We have no sense of determinations. Presumably, determinations means X as opposed to Y. So red as opposed to blue, you can substitute anything for the X. And as long as you don't have contrast, right, you're in the state of indeterminacy. Um, you have nothing to talk about because everything is indeterminate. And this seems to be, if we were to do like a sort of presuppositionalist philosophy, where you kind of have to begin in, right? You have to begin in the idea of, well, we have nothing or we have being. They're basically the same thing. They're the same thing because they're contentless, they're indeterminate, they're all immediate, and they're all imminent, right? They all seem to be imminently coming from the same sort of source. There isn't a contrast, there isn't a multiplicity at this point. In
Yeah,
order
and
to
you're absolutely right. You're
yeah,
absolutely right.
yeah, in order to introduce multiplicity, you'd have to introduce further differentiation and concepts that would associate themselves with that differentiation, like quality, right? Unless you introduce the vocabulary of quality, you can't make sense of it in that way.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think Hegel even describes this as like, what's the difference? Like, I think he used an analogy is like, what's the difference between going in a room entirely of black, like where you could not see, as in it's just pitch black, or in a room that is blinding like light? There is no difference. You are blinded regardless. Like there is no aspect of being from which you can contrast from one another. It's exactly the same. Now, there is an imminent experience of being or nothingness in this experience, um, but that is essentially, as you say, indeterminate. There is no knowledge that can be gained. You're absolutely right in that sense. There needs to be a contrast between things, and I mean that's essentially why he kind of hates Plato, isn't it? Like in the sense that the dialectic in Plato, because it sort of ends like every time. Like I mean, like not in a metaphysical sense, but in an epistemological sense, it ends um like waiting for the next category of contrast, where you wait for the antithesis to be given by a resurgence of a new thinker, a new thought, somebody else to join the conversation, rather than essentially attempting the conversation between the other and then using the infinites that's available to essentially, show the inherent contrast within being and nothingness. And that's why he kind of moves it away from like this the ancient dialectic to the modern dialectic, the Hegelian one. Oh, Hegel really rips into skepticism. He really does. In fact, like, just to show like his sentiment on skepticism, he says that you're not doing philosophy unless you're making positive claims. So he doesn't like pure skepticism. He just thinks that it's if in fact he thinks it's poor reasoning, um, that it's essentially like a one-sided reasoning, and that's his kind of like main issue with it. I probably have to go. I'm gonna have to go in probably in the next 5 minutes or so, if that's okay. Yeah, I mean, like, well, not really. I mean, I've just enjoyed the conversation more than anything. I hope, obviously, that I've expressed me, the position of Hegel with some justice. It's I really want to make a beginner's guide to it, because I feel like I need to just, I mean, even just for myself, I just need to flesh it out, just put it all on paper, and then just sort of kind of kind of like, make it intelligible for the average everyday individual, for the intermediate, and then hopefully for the adept. And it'll help me in that respect, because teaching helps you learn it in that same way. And so I hope when I have tried to transmit this thought, I've done it at least some justice, because I know that, like, a lot of the time I get accused of just rambling, and I'm talking absolute nonsense. And I think some of that comes with the complexity of the thought. Like, obviously it's quite difficult to comprehend, sorry, difficult concepts when you first kind of come into contact with them. But I think there is like the skills of being a good teacher, which make those concepts available regardless of that difficulty. And at least I hope that I've done a mediocre job in that respect.
Apparently, I was muted maybe the last five. I muted myself the last 4 or 5 minutes. But yeah,
Oh, really? Hell. Oh.
the problem with, I can't really give you an answer too much with whether you're clear or not about Hegel, because I've read Hegel, so you know how it is. It's just like a person
Yeah.
begins talking about it. I'm like, okay, well, I know what that concept means. I know exactly how you're employing it here. So even if you have difficulty, we just all get reminded of the actual text itself and then sort of progress the conversation. I've noticed it's very, very, very difficult. Very, very difficult to talk to certain people about Hegel, especially a lot of and again, I don't this isn't something that I want to dunk on. I don't think there's anything wrong with analytic philosophy in general, but it is so difficult talking to analytic philosophers about Hegel sometimes, because it's
Oh,
just
absolutely, absolutely.
because it's a priori, right? It's just, without even getting into it, it must be gibberish, right? Because Hegel must be gibberish, because Hegel just doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just an obscurantist. And this is a sort of frustrating angle to take, especially, I've even met a lot of people who have this sort of anti-history of philosophy angle, where they think like, well, we don't even have to investigate, or most of us don't have to investigate the history of philosophy, because we could just investigate particular ideas that came from the history of philosophy. Like, we could just talk about coherentism, or we could talk about
Yeah,
foundationalism.
I know a lot of people like that, particularly in the analytic tradition, as you say. And I think that comes from the fact that, like, what they read is papers. You read a very small paper, which basically denotes its, anything which it cannot cover to other papers, where it says, I do not have the length or the breadth to, deal with this, go and check out this other paper. And each paper essentially does that infinitely. And so you have this infinite regress where each paper just basically refers to another paper, and none of them actually refer to, like, the foundations of these thoughts, which have, progressed historically, as you say. And I think that's the whole point of Hegel. Everything is historically interwoven, and that thought itself is a historical progression in the progression of absolute spirit. And as these concepts grow epistemologically, we are able to gain understanding. I think it's ironic that, like, we see that, like, people, and I don't think it's, I think first and foremost, I think it exists in science. I think science rejects anything before it. Through knowledge is empirically grounded, and so all we need is the correct observation and mathematical deduction, and of course we will reach truth. I mean, regardless of the fact that to even have this point of investigating, and the reasoning in which we've, motivated us to this position in which we will investigate these features of reality is inherently historically embedded. All we need to do is essentially see the world in the right way, and then, of course, we have the knowledge. And I think that this analytic philosophy essentially steals the scientific aesthetic, which is, I mean, it's in the very language it uses, in the ways it creates words in relation to, the like various forms of theories, and the way that it even just functions in terms of papers. And so I don't necessarily hate analytic philosophy, because I think there are some really great analytic philosophers. And I think that the analytic philosophy continental philosophy divide mightn't even hold true in a lot of circumstances. You get like people who bridge the gaps, and I think a good philosopher knows how to bridge the gaps. They've read both sides. But you're absolutely right in saying that many of them, I think, just think that they can just waltz in and just start philosophy again. And all they have to do is essentially start thinking about the concepts and the ideas, and their reason alone will intuitively create their reason alone will construct the right answers, and that's all they need. But they don't see the point in which Hegel's making, which is this historically embedded reason.
Right. Anyways, yeah, since you got to go here in about 5 minutes, if you wanted to say anything for like a minute or so, like again reminding people who you are, you could do that real quick, and then we'll kind of part ways since you got to go.
Yeah. I mean, I hope you've enjoyed this more than anything. I hope that I've at least had a. I don't know how much I was able to contribute with the whole Heidegger aspect, as I say, like most of me experiences on young Heidegger. But I at least hope, like, there's been some interesting conversations for the audience, and obviously
well, no,
most
it
of
made
my
me think,
yeah. And most of my expertise relates to like Hegel and stuff. But if anyone wants to check out any of me stuff on meta-ethics and veganism, I have a channel, Perspective Philosophy. Go check it out. I really appreciate it. You can follow us on Twitter and stuff like that, and I also have a Discord server. Or you can just catch us on Discord. I think I'm in Marty's server. So if if you want to add us, you're very much welcome to, if you have any questions. And thank you very much for watching. Yeah.
Okay.
And thank you, Marty, for having us on.
Okay, Perspective Philosophy. Well, thanks for having me as well to talk to you. Hopefully we'll talk again sometime soon, man. You have a good one.
You have a good one, man. Take it easy.
Bye-bye. Okay, guys, so we've concluded that discussion. Hopefully that was fun enough for you guys. It was a little bit fun. I mean, it was it was pretty fun for me as well. Almost said a little bit fun. I didn't mean that. Since I began that Destiny video, I think I'll have to probably do the Destiny critique at a different date, since this ended up working out. Does the chat room have any sort of questions about this dialogue or anything that we wanted to go over before I head out here? Maybe we got nothing. Just as a reminder, guys, we're about to upload the video. I urge you all to subscribe to the philosophy chat on YouTube. It is also located underneath the Twitch. And then we'll have some more content basically coming out here shortly, along with the Destiny debate that we were talking about earlier. We're definitely gonna go over it, or I'm gonna go over it tomorrow, which I'm probably going to do tomorrow. And then after tomorrow, I'm going to continue the Talos Principle video game run, since someone was charitable enough to donate me that game to play through on these streams. That's another thing that I'm going to be doing. Yeah, I mean, we could probably. I mean, you seem to know what you're talking about, Brando. If you wanna come in as a guest someday, you're more than welcome to. Yeah, this is wrong. You just need to put the philosophy chat. Well, it doesn't work right now, but I don't know why it doesn't work. But if you just put in the philosophy chat, I think with a C instead of a channel, it should come through. Okay, well, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, that's what I wanted to do. Okay, so let's change it to ending, guys. I hope you've enjoyed the stream. I still need to work out these kinks and get used to streaming, since this is something that I began just doing recently, and also buying some stuff to do it. Okay, that's cool, Brandon. Or Brando. Okay, guys, well, I'll see you next time. You guys have a good one. Until next time, bye-bye.